views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hi, and welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet, a weekly program providing you the latest information, resources, services, and community efforts taking place locally here in the Bronx and virtually. I'm your host, Kibin, Alleyne. Coming up, as cases of Omicron, the COVID-19 variant, continue to rise, New York City teachers fear for their safety. One New York City teacher discusses the state of school health in the wake of an ongoing pandemic. Are public schools as safe as they promise? Then, several weeks ago, President Joe Biden announced a pause to student loan debt until May 2020. However, some activists are still calling to cancel student loans. Does President Biden actually have the authority to cancel student debt? After that, Ghislaine Maxwell, the former companion to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, was found guilty of abusing underage girls. Did the general public influence the decision in some way? And are you prepared for the next potential natural disaster? Go Bags may be the safety net you need to help you prepare for the unexpected. Will larger families find it more challenging to prepare? So please stick around. Open BxRx Tuesday starts now. Welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Kibin, Alleyne, and I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. Hearing the school bell was not the way some New York City teachers wanted to ring in the new year. As cases of Omicron, the COVID-19 variant, continues to rise, New York City teachers fear for their safety. Joining me to discuss a demand of teachers calling for a remote option is social studies teacher and UFT Solidarity member, Lydia Howrilka. Lydia, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you are among several teachers who were apprehensive about returning to in-person classes for 2021. Can you explain how those feelings began for you?
Well, a couple days before the start of the new year, Mayor de Blasio and Mayor-elect Eric Adams and Chancellor Misha Porter and Chancellor Banks released their the plan that they basically had to reopen schools safely at the start of the 2022 year. And unfortunately, due to lack of testing options, many of our students are unvaccinated. There have been tremendous cases of Omicron breakthrough infections happening for both staff and students, all New Yorkers across the tri-state area. Many teachers really were hesitant about going back in the wake of this surge. We saw a great drop in attendance leading right up to the Christmas holiday. And we predicted that there would be a similar lack of attendance leading up to, coming right after the new year. There have been many issues regarding teachers getting appropriate PPE, testing when requested. Certain staff members have been telling UFT Solidarity that they actually been turned away from testing when Test and Trace has come to the school. Not all students are being tested. It's a very small sample, actually, and not all parents have submitted consent forms. So essentially, a lot of students are not being tested. So there's a lot of cases of COVID that are being underreported in the DOE. So the DOE says that New York City schools are, quote, the safest place for kids to be. But as educators on the ground, we know that's very far from the truth.
So I want to kind of elaborate on that, because before we get into the return of schools after the past winter break, I like to just recap on the end of the school year. Last year, before school began, the mayor assured families and school staff that it would be a much safer school year than ever before. And many things were promised, such as HVAC systems and daily cleaning. As a New York City teacher, do you feel that was delivered?
Definitely not. COVID, as we know, is airborne. And Many of our schools, unfortunately, are over 50 years old, close to 100 years old. My own building is 80 years old. And our ventilation system are windows. In many classrooms, our windows don't work. In many schools across New York City, we do not have appropriate HVAC or any kind of ventilation system. The only way you get air is through open windows. Many teachers for the longest time thought that air conditioning units were ventilation, but now, of course, we know that they are not. There's just so many things the city promised us. The city promised us to upgrade school campuses. That never happened. We know it's very expensive. We know it's a wish list, but at the very least, can you at least shrink class sizes? The city said, "Oh, we'll give you smaller class sizes. We'll flood schools with more money," but not all principals hired enough staff. There's not enough space for these smaller classes. And where can you hold all these classes? Schools that are in co-located buildings, that means multiple schools are sharing one campus. They don't have enough space for everybody. So we are promised all these things: HVAC systems, quality air purifiers, adequate testing. All these things were promised to us and they never happened. So a lot of teachers, including myself, are upset. We are disgusted, and we truly feel that the city does not have our best intentions at heart.
Now, I understand you took a poll through U of T in regards to teachers and testing. Can you elaborate on what you found?
Yeah. So we tested our own membership and non-affiliated U of T members. This was a totally anonymous survey. It was optional for you to list your school, although a lot of members chose to list their school regardless. And we have found that 95% of teachers polled, and we polled over 300 teachers and school staff members, that testing was never announced. It was always this big surprise. You would hear it over the loudspeaker saying, "The testers have arrived. Students who have a blue card, please report to this room." And last year, teachers were able to get tested whenever they wished, which is great. But this year, it's if you don't have a prep or a lunch that period, you are out of luck.
Wow. Now, according to reports, despite filing a temporary restraining order against the DOE, you still returned to work. Can you explain your decision to still go to work, as we can see that, you're probably in a school setting now? Can you just explain what that feeling was like, even though you had these really strong feelings?
It's hard. I mean, I am a devoted educator. It's the core of my existence. It is part of my identity. But I'm also an activist. So I feel that I need to understand what my members are going through by being in the building, by being on the ground. And even though I'm fearful, today I took one of the rapid tests. Thankfully, I'm negative. That could change by the end of the day today. That could change by tomorrow. So I just be as careful as I can. Right now, I have all 4 windows wide open in my classroom, and I have fresh air blowing through. Thank goodness for that. Otherwise, I will be delivering this interview to you in a KN95 mask, because that's how I spend most of my day, in a KN95 mask with my students, covering classes when my colleagues are out. And it's just horrifying. I mean, the mayor says that, that students need to be in school, but guess what? Students can't get a good education if their teachers are sick and absent. Students can't get a good education if they themselves are sick. It's an absolute crime, the fact that we cannot have remote learning, at least for 2 weeks, until we can understand and figure out where is Omicron going. We haven't hit the peak yet. We probably may not hit the peak until the end of next week. It's ridiculous. It's ludicrous. Teachers learned how to make remote instruction work in March of 2020 to the end of last year. We made it work. We learned how to engage kids. There's no reason why we can't do remote instruction for emergencies like this. This is an emergency. We may not be in an actual snow blizzard, but we are in a viral blizzard, and we need to be safe at home.
Now, why do you think the city is so against going back to remote learning, even when it's temporary, like the 1 week or 2 weeks that you were hoping for?
I think the Mayor Adams, doesn't want to start his first term by angering parents. There is a very loud, vocal minority of parents who are part of this Keep Schools Open crowd, and they themselves are fearful because they fear learning loss. And granted, remote learning isn't for every kid, just like in-person learning isn't for every kid. But can your kid learn if they're in a hospital bed? Can I teach if I am in a hospital bed? No. We can have a happy medium. We can keep remote instruction for the kids who need it. We have homeschool for kids who need it. We have remote instruction for kids who have a diagnosed medical issue. If remote instruction works for those kids, why can't we broaden up to any kind of kid whose parent feels that they need this, right? Why can't we have remote instruction for teachers, open up to teachers who have medical issues, who are scared of being in their unsafe buildings? Have these teachers deliver remote instruction. They will be able to do what they love, and that is teach, and they'll be able to help the most needy kids who need that remote instruction.
Now, in a letter to families, New York City school chancellors Misha Porter and David C. Banks write, beginning January 3rd, schools will distribute free take-home COVID-19 rapid test kits to any students or staff who exhibit symptoms. Do you find this to actually be helpful?
It's one small thing, but if they were really serious about keeping schools safe, they would have a universal test to return policy. If you wish to return your kid to school, you need to have your kids submit a negative COVID test. My colleagues who have young kids in daycare have told me that in order for them to send their kid to daycare this week, they had to submit proof that their child was negative on a PCR test, not a rapid test, a PCR test. We have found through scientific studies that Omicron is not as easily detected via rapid tests as Alpha and Beta variants were for COVID. So the fact that they are giving us a rapid test is great, but since most people are coming down with the Delta and Omicron variants, and science is telling us that these tests frequently give out false negatives when people could be asymptomatic or symptomatic and maybe positive, if a test isn't telling you that you're positive, you could be going around the school infecting your colleagues, your peers. There's so many students who struggle with wearing a mask. I asked the chancellor to spend a day in a New York City high school, stand in the hallway and count how many students are not wearing a mask properly. How many noses do you see? How many mouths do you see? It is hard for a child to wear a mask all day, especially when there's not good ventilation to keep them comfortable all day. I understand. It's hard for me as an adult as well. But in light of this emergency, if you want your kid to feel as safe as possible, especially after traveling for the holidays, give them a chance to get a COVID test, a negative COVID test, if you're so against remote instruction.
Now, the state of COVID continues to change rapidly, and people have differing opinions on how the situation should be handled. How are you hoping the city plans to move forward with public education?
I would love for us to actually have mandated vaccines for kids. But I feel that based on what we've seen through Omicron, vaccines are not, a silver bullet to keep us safe from COVID. We need testing. We need reliable testing. We need healthcare. We need a lot of wraparound services to keep our kids safe. We need fully funded community schools. Our national government gave our state and city governments a ton of money, and this money has not been used properly and has not been seen in schools. We suspect, my colleagues in UFT Solidarity and the United for Change Coalition suspect that this money is being tied up to be used in district offices. If you want education to be fully funded and every kid to be given a fair shake, schools need to be given this money directly. We don't need the money tied up in bureaucratic or district offices. But this money needs to come into the hands of responsible principals and teachers and administrators in schools who know how to use this money to help their communities.
All right. Lydia, thank you so much for joining me to discuss this really important topic.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.
We know that people are dealing with the health crisis, but there's also a lot of food insecurity.
We're giving out healthy food options, and that's what's key here.
If you're a senior, you have a disability, they'll actually deliver meals to you.
The residents are anxious, they're worried, they're scared, they want to be tested.
When things were happening in our community and we couldn't get the help.
There's almost a presumption of criminality that attaches to your skin color.
The site will prioritize those who are at highest risk in the population.
If you feel symptoms and you'd like to visit one of these COVID-19 testing sites here in the Bronx, you may call the State Health Department's hotline.
Important to note about this site is no reservations are needed. This is a walk-in clinic.
A lot of us are out of work and looking for something to do.
We have the machinery and the skills to make large scales of these masks and gowns.
Take care of your people. It's going to go way further than we actually can understand.
Right now, employees like myself are just adjusting to the new reality.
Reporting from BxRx, this is Ciera.
Welcome back. Several weeks ago, President Joe Biden announced a pause to student loan debt until May 2022. While it's a relief for many, co-founder of Roots Action, Jeff Cohen, joins me to discuss if this move is truly enough for many struggling with student loan debt. Jeff, thank you for joining me.
Great to be with you.
So the issue of student debt has been a long time concern for many individuals. What was your initial reaction to Joe Biden extending the student loan payments?
I was very happy. I mean, there's so many people, and they're not all young people. They're grappling with student debt decades later. So many people were freaked out. So the extension of the payment from February 1 to May 1, it's a good thing, but it's just too small. What we need is the president to use his authority that Senator Chuck Schumer keeps encouraging him to use his authority to cancel up to $50,000 per person that has that much debt. And it's an issue that if Biden could be persuaded to use his executive authority, it could make the lives of so many people better. And the most important thing from a public policy perspective, it's a way to stimulate the economy from the ground up. It's a real economic benefit for society as a whole, not just the 43 or so million people that are now grappling with student debt.
So do you think the additional 3 months is actually helpful?
Yeah, the 3 months is very helpful because during COVID, people are really suffering. But it's just not a long-term problem. And we have a long-term problem to solve. And President Biden could solve it. I'm old enough, I went to a public university in 1969, and tuition was almost free. The average tuition for a semester when I went to college was about $300, $400 a semester. And now at all these public colleges and universities, the tuition has doubled, tripled, quadrupled, even if you allow for inflation. So, if the price of cars and housing and food has gone, from here to here, the price of college tuition, even at public universities, has gone up to here. And it's not the case in other countries. In Europe, higher education is still cheap or free. And it should be in our country. We are a wealthy country. You should not be punished for going to a public a college or university. It should be encouraged. I mean, people have more college loan debt than they have credit card debt or auto loan debt. So it's really a serious problem, and President Biden could solve it.
Now, I'm really happy that you brought that up because according to your website and some of the research that I found, student loans are a $1.7 trillion industry. I just want to know, how did this issue become such a huge problem for our country? You kind of touched on it a little bit,
Yeah.
But why is it continuing to grow?
Yeah, it's a problem because we have disinvested in education. And, in my era, working class people, middle class people could go to college, and it didn't put the whole family into debt, which is what's happening now. So, besides it being a societal-wide problem, and remember, half of the people with student debt, they went to public colleges. About a quarter went to these for-profit private colleges that you see advertised on television. Some of them are pretty unscrupulous. But if you took the right solution, which is to forgive this debt, which shouldn't be there in the first place. I didn't have this debt in 1969 and 1972. It would stimulate the economy from the ground up. People would be able to start businesses. People would be able to work in their profession in the way that they want. People would be able to buy homes. It's truly an economic stimulus, and it doesn't look like there's much happening with Build Back Better in Washington. This is something President Biden could do himself.
Now, I'm really happy that you mentioned that because I'm sure he is feeling the pressure. A lot of people have been talking about it. And I think only more and more people are starting to understand this issue. But can you explain how he actually does, or how he actually has the authority to kind of cancel the student debt?
Yeah, Senator Schumer, Senator Warren, they're arguing that under the Higher Education Act of 1965, which was Congress saying that authority over student debt and how high and what interest, it would go to the executive branch. So it's now within the purview of the Department of Education. How do we know this? Trump did a very tiny change, citing at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, where he eliminated the interest. He waived the interest rates on repayment. So Biden has his Justice Department now looking at whether he's got the authority. If Trump had the authority, why doesn't Biden have the authority? I mean, what's wonderful is that there's so many members of Congress that are saying, President, do it. Help the economy grow, help racial justice, help economic justice. I mean, I saw Jamal Bowman has been great on this issue. AOC has been great on this issue. And she made the point, she used the word delusional, that Democratic Party leaders are delusional if they think they're going to stay in power without addressing this serious issue of student debt. Cori Bush was a Congresswoman first term from St. Louis. She was a Black Lives Matter activist a couple years ago. And she tweeted on Christmas Day, "All I want for Christmas is for Biden to cancel student debt." So you've got, Schumer, Warren, Bernie Sanders in the Senate. You've got all sorts of Congress members, including Congress members from the Bronx. It's really, this is the time to do something dramatic to help the working class and especially people of color.
So I kind of want to know, like, all these people are saying, like, let's cancel this student debt. Do you have any idea why, they may be withholding from canceling student debt? Do you have any, like, suspicions or any ideas on why they just won't cancel it?
Biden is not a progressive like some of these others I've mentioned. And Biden has never been great about shaking up the status quo in a working class direction. When he's pressed on student debt publicly, like at a CNN town meeting a few months ago, he goes off on a tangent. Like, I remember Ronald Reagan, when he'd be asked about government support for the poor, he would argue against it. Well, no, you heard about that woman in Chicago that's driving the Cadillac and receives welfare. It was sort of a non sequitur. It was stupid. Well, what Biden does is he talks about I don't want to give billions of dollars in student debt relief to people that have gone to Harvard and Yale and Penn. He brings up the Ivy League. Ivy League students or graduates are carrying a fraction of 1% of the total debt. It's people of color, Black students, Black people, Black graduates are carrying disproportionate amounts of student debt. Black students more than white students, and people of color students more than white students take out student debt. They take more student loans, and they take longer to pay off the student loans. And, we have a racial wealth gap in this country, and college was supposed to reduce the racial wealth gap. But actually, people have gone to college. You compare white households, college educated households, to Black college educated households, and the racial wealth gap is greater among graduates. And the main reason its racial wealth gap is greater is student loan debt. So, I mean, let's face it, Biden would not be in the White House. It was a close election, if not for young voters, Black voters, people of color, progressive activists. He could really do for the working class as a whole, of all colors, this cancellation of student debt.
How can we, well, I really appreciate you, like, telling us about it. I wish we could really, like, go on and on about it so much more because there's so much information regarding this topic. But how can people stay up to date with your organization and just to learn more about this issue?
Well, we're going to be focusing on this issue, rootsaction.org. People can find us. We also have a website called progressivehub.net. We will be working with a lot of groups. I encourage people to look at the Debt Collective, which is another group that's working on this. They're a group that came out of the Occupy Wall Street movement 10 years ago, the Debt Collective. But you will be hearing from Roots Action in the coming weeks and a lot of allies. We are going to get louder at the end of January, and then February, we're going to be really loud. President Biden, do something, really make the country move forward in a way that Joe Manchin can't stop you. Republican leaders, McConnell can't stop you. You've got the executive authority, use it.
All right, Jeff, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.
you're struggling to afford your internet bills during the pandemic, there's a temporary government program that may be able to help. It's called the Emergency Broadband Benefit, and it provides up to $50 monthly discount on your broadband bill to qualifying households. Find more information about the program, including if you qualify and how to enroll, at fcc.gov/broadbandbenefit, or call toll-free at 833-511-0311. That's 833-511-0311.
Welcome back. A story that once seemed like it only existed on internet conspiracy forums has now become nationwide news. Ghislaine Maxwell, the former companion to American financier and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, was found guilty of conspiring with him to recruit, groom, and sexually abuse underage girls as young as 14 years old. Joining me to discuss the verdict is President of West Coast Trial Lawyers, Neama Rahmani. Neama, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a huge story, and to fully understand the weight of this victory, we need to understand how this actually began. So for those who don't know, can you briefly tell us about the controversy surrounding Jeff Epstein and now Ghislaine Maxwell?
And Jeffrey Epstein was one of the richest and most powerful men in America, and he was connected to Hollywood celebrities like Kevin Spacey, members of the royal family like Prince Andrew, and even former presidents like Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. And he is alleged and was convicted of sexually abusing young women. Before he could really receive federal criminal justice, he was arrested, but he was found dead in his cell. Some folks think he was killed, while the official reports say that he committed suicide.
Now, the New York Times reports Maxwell's trial was widely seen as the courtroom reckoning that Epstein never had. As you mentioned, Epstein was found dead, but if he had gone to trial, is it possible he would have seen the same charges for these crimes?
No question. He would also be looking at sex trafficking charges. He was arrested and charged in Florida many years ago, but when Alex Acosta was United States attorney there, he gave him a very controversial state disposition where he served some limited time in county jail, but he was allowed out to work. And ultimately, Alex Acosta was appointed to be the Secretary of Labor under former President Trump, but he had to resign when word of this settlement became public.
Now, Maxwell was found guilty on 5 of the 6 counts. She now faces up to 40 years for sex trafficking of minors, 10 years for another count, and so much more. She is looking at decades in prison. However, it's alleged that Maxwell's team plans to appeal. Can you explain how that will change the outcome of this verdict?
I don't expect her conviction to be reversed on appeal, but that is her only chance of getting a reduced sentence. Highly unlikely that the Second Circuit, which is the Court of Appeals, reverses her conviction. But her really only legal alternative is to cooperate and start naming names. And her family has made it clear that she maintains her innocence despite being convicted, and that she's not going to identify others who participated in sexual acts with Jeffrey Epstein.
Now, we often hear about repeals in cases where someone feels they were wrongly convicted, but can you just explain how that actually works?
Well, it's always possible for someone to be wrongfully convicted, but there's an overwhelming amount of evidence against Ghislaine Maxwell. There's no question that she was very close to Jeffrey Epstein. And 4 different accusers came to court and testified about sexual acts involving Jeff Epstein, which Maxwell also participated in.
Now, like you mentioned a little bit, you don't believe Maxwell has legal basis to appeal. Can you just further explain why?
Well, the primary basis for her appeal will be what we call prior bad acts witnesses. And we've seen this in the recent Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein cases, where some jurors have a difficult time believing the testimony of one victim and testifying and convicting on that basis. They need more. So what the government did in this particular case is to put victim after victim after victim to testify that Maxwell was engaged in misconduct. And at least one of those victims was 17 and of age. And the basis for Maxwell's appeal is that because she was of age, she should not have testified as a prior bad acts witness.
Wow. Now, one concern some people have revolves around Maxwell's cooperation, and you kind of mentioned that a little bit. What does cooperation mean in the courtroom, and how does it, does it actually even absolve the criminal from their punishment?
It does not, but it can be a basis for a lesser or reduced sentence. So under the federal sentencing guidelines, it's a point-based system, and you can get points off for cooperation. Now, Maxwell first has to cooperate, start identifying other individuals. They need to be prosecuted, and she ultimately may need to testify either before the grand jury or at trial in those prosecutions. And if she does, then she may get points off her sentence. But the government is going to be very hesitant to offer any type of lenient sentence or slap on the wrist because of the perception that Jeff Epstein never received the criminal punishment that he deserved.
No, I love that you mentioned the whole idea of like slap on the wrist, and some people say, call it giving someone a free pass. I think it's important to note that in these cases with high profile people, a lot of people do often believe that they kind of get away with murder or get away with doing things that they probably shouldn't. Can you just explain the importance of like not giving free passes despite your social class or your standing in society?
Well, there is rightfully a public perception that Jeffrey Epstein did not receive the sentence that he deserved because of his money and because of his influence, and that he was allowed to victimize so many young women. So obviously there's been a shift in society. Women that have been victims before have come forward. They are now empowered, and it's time to hold individuals like Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and those who participate in these acts with them accountable in a way that our criminal justice system has not for decades.
Now, I love that you mentioned that because that kind of goes into my next question. I think this guilty verdict is a victory for many because these are very powerful people that we're talking about. And we've seen something similar with Weinstein, Bill Cosby, R. Kelly, and now this situation. One of the victims, Annie Farmer, states that this demonstrates that no one is above the law. What do you think this is saying about our current state of our justice system? And are we changing as a society?
We are. And the fact that prosecutors are taking these challenging cases where young women have been victimized. Let's not forget, R. Kelly was acquitted the first time he was tried. Bill Cosby, the first time he was tried, that jury hung. Weinstein's victims suffered for many years before he was finally brought to justice. And Jeffrey Epstein, even though he's dead, I'm glad that the Department of Justice and prosecutors are finally holding Ghislaine Maxwell and others who may have participated with him accountable.
And regarding the way we as society discuss sexual assault, do you think the general public influenced this in some way? Because in the beginning, I stated that this, it seemed like it only existed online where people kind of talked about these things. So do you think the general public influenced this kind of decision in some way?
It does, because for these prosecutions to be successful, victims have to come forward. They have to testify. And part of the psychology of a sexual abuse victim is that it's challenging for them to do so. Sometimes they don't report it right away, and years pass because they're ashamed or they blame themselves. But ultimately, they have no one to blame but their victim. And as women come forward, they tell their story. That empowers and encourages others to do the same thing. And that's how these prosecutions can be successful.
Now, do you feel Epstein's victim is receiving some sort of justice through Maxwell's conviction?
No question that Maxwell's conviction is a vindication for the 4 victims who testified. They had to get in front of a jury and tell their story of abuse in a very public way. So they were victimized once again. And the fact that those 12 jurors returned a guilty verdict really is a vindication for them and everyone else who has been abused by Jeff Epstein.
Now, moving forward, it's a lot of talk about, the abusers, but I want to focus on the victims a little bit more. What are some ways that you can support victims through this? Although this is a victory, I'm sure they may be feeling something else. What is some way that we can continue to support victims of these type of situations?
Well, there are many organizations that are set up to help victims of childhood sexual abuse across a wide variety of states. And these women have also retained lawyers. They've engaged in civil litigation and lawsuits against Jeffrey Epstein and his estate. At least one victim or alleged victim has sued Prince Andrew, alleging that he participated in the abuse. There's been others who have been named as well. And really just the social media rallying around these women, supporting them, it has helped them come forward and tell their story in a way that, frankly, they just weren't comfortable doing so in the past.
And I'm really happy to hear that. And I'm really happy as a society that we are changing and that more people are feeling, confident enough to talk about this. Now, I want to ask you, how can people stay up to date with you and to learn more about just learning about these cases in general?
Yeah, please follow us on social media, westcoasttriallawyers.com at West Coast Trial Lawyers or West Coast Trial on Instagram and Twitter, respectively. We talk about all these cases and we cover them as they're happening. So you can stay up to date on our criminal justice system and how victims are finally having their voice heard.
And lastly, I want to ask you your personal opinion on just the outcome and, were you glad to see that, more and more people are speaking out and these people are actually kind of getting the things that they deserve?
I'm incredibly happy. I've been practicing for 20 years and I've handled a lot of crimes against women. And I've seen a clear shift right now that these powerful men that used to take advantage of their sex and their money and their position, they're finally being brought to justice in a way that frankly hasn't happened when I started my legal career.
All right, Neama, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me about such an important topic.
Thanks for having me.
All right, we'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.
When taking public transportation, don't touch your phone. Carry hand sanitizer and use it immediately upon leaving the bus or train. Avoid touching your face. If someone is coughing or sneezing, move away. Wash your hands with soap and water as soon as possible. Limit contact with poles. If possible, avoid rush hour. Don't eat or drink on public transportation. Keep your bag off the floor or other surfaces. Avoid directly touching turnstiles. Stay up to date with the latest from your local health department and CDC.
most at risk for coronavirus. People over 65, people with underlying medical conditions like heart disease, chronic lung disease, asthma, diabetes, people undergoing cancer treatment, and people with weakened immune systems. What should you do if you or a loved one is at higher risk? Avoid close contact with people. Avoid crowds. Stay home if you can. Wash your hands frequently. Learn more ways to protect yourself and others at coronavirus.gov.
Welcome back. New York City has seen its fair share of natural disasters, from winter storms to hurricanes. But have you ever truly been prepared? Joining me for a discussion on tips to safely navigate some of these disasters is Go Back participant Ciera Waller and U.S. spokesman for Jehovah Witness Robert J. Hendriks. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you very much for having us.
So let's jump right into it. New York City's Emergency Management Department recommends go bags for all New Yorkers. Ciera, from your experience, can you tell us what go bags are?
Well, go bags, it's a ready to go book bag that you have prepared with essential materials such as water, food, and any medications possibly needed, as well as good to have some loose cash as well, just in case.
Yeah, and there's nothing really more important than being prepared in an emergency. You know, what we found as Jehovah's Witnesses all over the world, really, starting in about the early 2000s, that while FEMA and emergency management offices do an excellent job of helping us in time of disaster and crisis, the problem is that first 72 hours. And so in that first 2 or 3 days, you may not have water, you may not have electricity, you may not have help. Somebody may not even be able to get to you, or you may have fled your home. And so it's that time that you really need to look to cover that period in the essentials that you need. And go bags can include not simply food, but clothing that's packed tight, food for your pet, things for your children, things that will keep people busy, things that will keep you sane, recordings of your belongings, so many things that need to be carefully planned so that it doesn't get so heavy that it's a stop bag. But we want it to be mobile, but we want it to be useful for that first, especially 48 to 72 hours.
Now, Robert, how has your background with Jehovah Witness helped you understand the importance of preparing for natural disasters?
You know, I come from Long Island, and so grew up there, went through some serious hurricanes. Hurricane Bell in the 70s, which put out our electricity and our water for 2 weeks. Hurricane Gloria in the 80s. And frankly, when you're young and you go through these things, it's almost like you don't even think about them anymore. You huddle together, you prepare, but you don't think about fleeing your home. But, when Sandy hit, especially, I think about Sandy and what it did to our community, what it did to our congregation. It was very clear that all the preparedness that we had taken, all the meetings and the reminders that we had, really all accrued to the benefit of so many, because it was a different kind of disaster, a disaster that New York City hadn't seen, the south shore of Long Island had not seen, people losing houses, people in boats, people on their roofs. And I think that all those years that we were preparing as an organization, it came for me, and it's late in life, unfortunately, it came to me that this is the way you preserve life, not just your things, not just to feed yourself, but it's the way you keep living. And that's really the key, the sacredness of life. And that has been something that has been really put into us over decades of time by our congregations, making sure that life is first, belonging second.
Now, why would a religious organization encourage its congregants to prepare for a disaster?
Well, the Bible principle of the man who conceals himself can see the danger. So you see the danger, you conceal yourself. In other words, you're thinking prospectively. You're not thinking just for today. You're thinking ahead. And that's what Christians do. They think in advance, because guess what? It's about life. we talk all the time about the sacredness of life as religious organizations, as Christians. We talk about preserving life when it comes to the unborn. We talk about preserving life when it comes to bald tires and being equipped in your car. But being prepared for a disaster in the days that we live in today is just part now of what we need to do as human beings, as a society, because we value life. And the small amount of time and money that you put into preparing for a disaster will really save so much on the other end. It's so worth the lives that are saved as a result of this. And literally, our preparedness and our annual preparedness as congregations around the world have saved lives. As recently as the Kentucky tornadoes, where one of our families was preserved when they fled their home, and they had the resources available because they were just warned about that just very, very recently, within days of the disaster. And they were prepared. Same thing all over the world, where we have seen our brothers and sisters put life ahead of belongings, and that really is the key.
Now, Ciera, I understand that this idea actually helped you with Hurricane Ida, I believe, and you can correct me. In New York, we have seen our fair share of disasters, as I mentioned. So can you detail that experience and what you went through?
Yeah. Well, being in New York, it seems unexpected to have a natural disaster. But just from my experience of the water coming through my home, I would have never known that it would have came up so much that it destroyed a lot of things. But because I had my go bag prepared, ready, already at the door, it was easy to just get it, grab it, and then head on out. Again, most important thing is your life first, and just having those essential items to help you through that disaster is very important.
No doubt, and she wasn't alone. We had those who were on the same streets as others who had lost their lives in New York City, and because they were prepared, because they were able to flee, because they were prepared to respond to the emergency, their lives were preserved. And really, when you come right down to it, it just takes a small amount of preparation to be prepared for something of a disaster. Now, we're very good as congregations in rallying around our brothers and sisters when there's a need. They lose their home, they have a home. That's no problem. They lose their life, we can't do much about that.
Now, what are some steps people should consider when preparing? I know you touched on it a little bit, but I want to go more in depth. So what are the steps people should know when they are preparing for these unfortunate times?
Well, the first thing that they should know, number one, we don't want it to happen, but we have to think it's going to happen. That at some point in our life, even if we live in Brooklyn, Long Island, even upstate New York, a natural disaster is inevitable. Whatever that is. We had an ice storm in Texas recently that affected more of our brothers and sisters, more of their homes than ever before in our history as an organization. That was completely unexpected. People were freezing in their homes without electricity. They were burning, paintings and getting wood outside to burn something to keep themselves warm. The fact is that it's going to happen. So that's number one. Number one is it's going to happen. It's inevitable. Don't scare yourself, but now prepare. How do we prepare our children? What do we tell them? We need a family discussion. Where would we go? If you're at school and we're at work, where would we meet? What belongings should we take? Where would we put them? How often do we look at those belongings? Are the batteries still alive? Do we have proper, is the food and the water still good in our go bag? How accessible is it? Where would we meet if we were to have to come from different places? Where would we go if we need to flee from our home and get out of the area? Whose home? And who would we tell in advance that that's where we would be? All of those things we encourage our congregants to do, because what we try to do in a disaster, and what actually we don't try to do it, we do it. For the last 2 decades, what we have done is we call every single congregant in the disaster area, and we make sure they're okay. We make sure of their status. So we need to find out their numbers, whether it's the mobile number or where they're fleeing. And that kind of communication and that kind of community can not only save lives, but also give us a sense of peace in a time of crisis. And you know that anxiety rises during these times. Keeping ourselves calm and peaceful during this time so we can be strong for our family and others is very important as well.
Thank you. Now, Ciera, I want to know, how long did it take you, because you're actually, one of the people who went through this, how long did it take you to actually figure out what was needed and what was important to keep? And what would you say to other families who are maybe struggling, or people who are struggling to kind of get it together?
First of all, I looked to there's an Awake magazine on the jw.org. It's the 2017 Awake number 5, and it gives you an outline of different things you can use to prepare yourself for a disaster. So that's what I used. I went through that list when the pandemic first happened, and I said, this is very important that I need to have ready right away. And so I let that list be my guide, and then I just started filling it up. But one thing I would say to families, it's better to be prepared beforehand. Again, sometimes, being in New York, you think it's not going to happen, but it's better to be prepared, because life is more precious than personal belongings. So I would get on it.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for joining me to have this really, really important discussion. Can you just quickly let us know how we can stay in touch?
Yeah, please. jw.org, the most translated website on the globe, on the planet. And when you go there, you can put in go bags in the search. You can put in disasters. You can put in anxiety, and you'll get a host of articles and videos that will help you prepare. As well as if you need to contact us, you can contact us or a local congregation right through the website, and we'll be happy to make a visit virtually or by phone or by letter, and we'll be sure to be in touch.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. That's all for our show today. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Kibin, wishing you and yours safety and wellness now and always. See you next time.